Golden Blooded back with another video just for you, the college football fans. So if you are a college football fan, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button. That's all we do here every single day. And don't forget to go ahead and check out our Patreon page. I call our Patreons the shot callers because they call the shots around here. Also, don't forget to check out our website, designed and created by Joey Foster. We now have 9 great writers, led by our 2 head writers, Michael Walker and Scotty B. the Baylor King. So today I want to talk about the perfect scenario for the Big 12. And to be honest with you, this wasn't my idea. This was one of my viewers' ideas. So shout out to Philip Bond. He left a great comment on yesterday's video, and I liked it so much that I decided to do a video on it myself. I made one little change to it, but basically it's the exact idea that he came up with. So I really appreciate it. I'm going to get with Joey and see if we can set up something for you to get something free on the merchandise store. Here we go, the perfect scenario for the Big 12. So this isn't a prediction or even my opinion. This would just be the perfect scenario for the Big 12 if this were to happen. So first, let's talk about the moves for the other conferences. In this scenario, the moves for the Big 10 would be grabbing Washington, Oregon, USC, and UCLA from the Pac-12. And honestly, I think that could actually happen. I think there's a real possibility that the Big 10 could go out and get those 4 major brands from the Pac-12. But the other move for the Big 10 would be getting Notre Dame, Virginia, Virginia Tech, Syracuse, Boston College, and Pitt from the ACC. And even though I don't think that's highly likely, it actually makes sense. All those teams would fit in regionally, and they have the academics to get accepted into the Big 10. So I like that. Next up, the SEC. The moves the SEC would make. Well, they would grab Clemson, Florida State, North Carolina, and Duke from the ACC. Once again, very doable. I could actually see that happening. So going from that, these are the moves that the Big 12 could make for a perfect scenario for the Big 12. First, they could grab Miami, Georgia Tech, NC State, and Louisville out of the ACC. Since the Big 12 already has West Virginia, Cincinnati, and UCF in the East, this isn't that far of a stretch. But on top of that, they could go out west and grab Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, Utah, Cal, Stanford, Oregon State, and Washington State. Now, out of all these ideas, that's probably the biggest stretch of them all, but it's still doable. The biggest piece to that puzzle would be the glue that Colorado and Utah and the Arizona schools would provide for your Cals, your Stanfords, your Oregon States, and your Washington States. So you would have a Big 12 that is stretched from coast to coast. So after this, the SEC would have 20 members. Georgia, South Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, Vanderbilt, Florida, Missouri, Texas, Clemson, Florida State, Oklahoma, Texas A&M, LSU, Ole Miss, Arkansas, Mississippi State, Alabama, Auburn, North Carolina, and Duke. The Big 10 would have 24 members. Ohio State, Penn State, Rutgers, Maryland, Michigan, Michigan State, Indiana, Northwestern, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, Purdue, Notre Dame, Virginia, Virginia Tech, Syracuse, Washington, Oregon, USC, UCLA, Boston College, and Pitt. That is a big conference, and that's coast to coast as well. Now for the SEC and the Big 10, I'm not going to break down the region pods. This is about the Big 12. So the Big 12, after all these moves, would have 24 members. And here's how the pods for the Big 12 would look. First, you'd have your Pacific pods, A and B. In Pod A, you'd have Cal, Stanford, Oregon State, and Washington State. That makes a lot of sense. Those 4 teams know each other very well. That would be a very easy transition. Pod B, the Arizona schools, Arizona, Arizona State. And then on top of that, BYU and Utah. Really the only team that those teams are not used to is BYU. And really they actually are used to BYU because BYU plays Pac-12 teams on a regular basis. In fact, last year BYU is considered the unofficial Pac-12 South champions. So that's very doable. And I think all 4 of those teams would be okay with that. Then you'd have the central pods, A and B. Pod A, Colorado, Kansas, Kansas State, and Oklahoma State. It got a little tricky here, so this was the best that I could do. And it still makes sense. I think those teams are close enough together to where that regional pod would make sense. Now for the central pod B, basically the Texas schools. You'd have TCU, Houston, Baylor, and Texas Tech. All current or future Big 12 members. And they're all in the state of Texas. Makes a lot of sense. Then finally the Atlantic pods. Pod A would be West Virginia, Cincinnati, Louisville, and Iowa State. Iowa State was the only team that I had trouble placing in a pod. But because of Louisville, it's not that far-fetched. Louisville stretches that out a little farther west, and Iowa State even a little farther more west. So I think that pod could be doable. And then finally, the Atlantic Pod B. You'd have Miami, Georgia Tech, NC State, and UCF. That would make sense as well. Now the side effect to this would be there would be no more Pac-12. This would be the best case scenario for the Big 12 and the worst case scenario for the Pac-12 because they would get picked apart. And if you look at the teams, it would be mostly by the Big 12. And I do think that if the Pac-12 does get picked apart, the Big 12 would have a lot of say in that because the Big 12 is closest to the Pac-12. I do think the Big Ten is interested in those schools that were mentioned in that comment, Washington, Oregon, USC, and UCLA, but they're not interested in those other schools, and the Big 12 would be the closest conference to pick up those other schools. Now the SEC could also be in play because those four teams, Washington, Oregon, USC, and UCLA, are big enough brands and bring in enough money to where it would be worth the stretch for the SEC to go out west and grab those teams. But the other teams, the SEC would not be interested in. So once again, the Big 12 would be the closest conference to grab the rest of the Pac-12. If you think about it, the ACC would also be in the same boat because only Wake Forest would be the only team left with the label of the ACC. So they basically wouldn't exist either. So the Big 12 is actually in a good position except for one thing. They have been reactive, not proactive. So what's been happening is they've been picked apart and then having to find teams to fill that up. Case in point, the first round, they lost Missouri, Texas A&M, Colorado, and Nebraska. Now to their credit, they did go out and get West Virginia and TCU. Two pretty good teams, but that was a reactive move, not a proactive move. Then more recently, they lost Oklahoma and Texas. Big hit for the Big 12, big hit. Their reactive move, they went out and got Houston, UCF, Cincinnati, and BYU. The Big 12 has got to be more proactive and not reactive if they want to stick around. Because if they don't stop doing that, it's just going to get watered down, watered down, watered down, watered down, to the point where it's going to look like a Group of 5 conference. The Big 12 is in danger of looking like a Group of 5 conference in the future if they don't stop the trend. So the Big 12 needs to be proactive, not reactive, or the future could be very, very dim for the Big 12. And teams would probably start thinking about jumping ship. Well, they already have. I'm talking about the rest of the Big 12. The remaining core members of the Big 12 could start thinking about jumping ship. It's happened before. You can't say it won't happen again. Very possible. So y'all let me know in the comments section. I know this is a little far-fetched, but if this were to happen, how would you feel about the perfect scenario for the Big 12? And are fans of Pac-12 teams committed to staying to the Pac-12? Or would they be okay with going to another conference if that's what's best for their team? Same question would go out to the fans of teams that are in the ACC right now. Are you more committed to the ACC? Or are you more committed to your team making the best decision for your team? Personally, I would choose what's best for your team. Don't be committed to a conference if they're making bad decisions and going the wrong direction. That's just my opinion. That's all I got for you for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.